Good afternoon, folks. This is our first foray into creating our online video tutorials for ART 259 during the spring quarter here of 2020 at Oakton Community College. As you know, we are not meeting face-to-face for the remainder of the term. It looks like we will be doing everything via the web, probably until the end of the course in May, I would imagine. If anything changes, I will certainly let you know. I'll send out emails and put notices up on our school logjam website. Anyway, I wanted to move forward with what we had talked about a little bit a couple weeks ago, starting our Founding Fathers class website. And I just wanted to follow through on that. I thought maybe the best thing to do, since we've lost some time and people may have lost track of files and whatnot, that it might be a good thing to start over from scratch, even though we did have a certain amount of content set up there. I thought for our purposes now, maybe we'll just start over. You can see here I am currently in Dreamweaver, and you can see I have a site definition over on the right-hand panel in my Files panel. I have Founding Fathers, and inside there I have the Founding Fathers text, just the text document that we had used previously in school, and the images subfolder that has all those images of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and good old George Washington. So what we want to do to begin with is to create our first HTML page, and I want to stop the recording right here for a moment in order to reorganize things, but we in a moment will go up and create our first HTML page. So hold on tight. All right, boys and girls, we are back, and as I mentioned, I want to create our first opening page for our Founding Fathers website. We did this already, as I mentioned, in class, but might as well do it over again here so that you have a clear indication of exactly what to do. So as I mentioned, we have the site definition opened up in Dreamweaver. I have the Founding Fathers website here with the local files on the right-hand side panel. And I want to create a new HTML page. So of course we go up to the main Dreamweaver file dropdown and go New. And as usual, we see the New Document dialog box, and we can simply select Create there. And bingo! As usual, Dreamweaver creates a nice skeleton HTML page for us. Let me close the bootstrap animation here. We have the doc type on line 1, which is required. We have our HTML, our head, and our body tags. Inside the head, of course, we have the meta tag with the character set, and we want to use UTF-8, which is the normal character set we use for international purposes. And we also have a title. In the title, we've got just a placeholder for untitled document. So in that place, I'm going to put Founding Fathers, and then I'll say home page. because this will be the introductory page to our site. In fact, as I mentioned in class, we may simply do this one page and simply add more and more stuff to this one page instead of making several pages. So, but this page will be pretty comprehensive. All right, so what else do we need to do? If we want to add cascading style sheet rules at some point to our page, we want to begin anyway by adding a style tag inside the head of the document. Now remember, I've mentioned several times that once we get ready to deploy our website, we want to take the style CSS rules out of the head of the document and place them into an external CSS file, which we can then use and link to all the various pages that we may have in our real world website. But as I've said before, for purposes of learning, I find it easier to keep the cascading style sheet rules in the same file as the HTML. That way we only have one file to worry about. So I'm not sure whether we want to make any rules right now, although I oftentimes will make certain basic rules even before I begin. Might not be a bad idea to create a body rule. So I'm going to start with body, and I want to set the margin to 0, and I want to set the padding to 0. That's often what I do, and oftentimes what a lot of developers will do right off the bat. If we have some kind of a choice in our heads already for the base font that we want to use for the site, then we could add a font family. And I could do that. We can always change this later if we decide to go in another direction. And of course, once we do that, Dreamweaver has some built-in font stacks that allow us to add a number of different fonts all at once. And I think for the purposes of this site, Founding Fathers going back to the 1700s, we probably would look a little bit better if we used a serif font. So maybe I'll choose this Baskerville Palatino Century School Book stack up here and put a semicolon at the end of that. We can also set the base size of the font. So I might write font size. If we want the fonts to be just a little bit bigger, I found that if we're using a serif font, the base size of the serif font sometimes is a little bit smaller than the sans serif versions. So I might increase the size of the font by going 1.1 em. When we do that, we're essentially adding 10% to the base size of our font. It's the same thing as if we had increased the font size to 110%. And we can also add line height. Line height determines the space between the baseline of sentences in a paragraph and other text-based elements. And again, because the web is a little bit more difficult to parse for people in terms of reading text, it's suggested by a lot of developers that we use a little bit more space between sentences in order to make our text a little bit easier to read. So I might go something like 1.45. That might be a little too much. But again, we can always go back and change that if we want. And remember, I've said this a few times in the past, but the line height is one of the very few properties that can take a value without any unit of measure. So saying 1.45 is really the same as saying 1.45 m or 145%. And you can use those units of measure if you want, but for some online server systems, using just plain 1.45 is said to sometimes be a little bit safer. I'm not sure whether that's true anymore, but I know in the past it has been, and it's something that I just have gotten into the habit of doing. So even before we have any content, we can set up some of these basic rules that we kind of know ahead of time are going to be useful for us. Another rule that we might want to add is a rule for the wrapper div element that we've oftentimes put around all of the content on our page in order to limit the effective width of the page and also to center the content inside the browser. So I might do that. I might go and create a rule called .wrapper. Remember, when we're writing a rule for a class, we want to use the dot in front of the identifier that we have used in our HTML attribute. So if we have a div tag called with a class of wrapper, we want to use .wrapper as the selector for our CSS. And oftentimes we will create the margin trick. We'll go margin 0 auto. This is what will center the content inside the browser window. And we will create a max width. When we use max width as opposed to just width, we are giving ourselves the ability to kind of accordion and squeeze down the width of the page if the browser window is smaller. So that's often a nice thing to do for the definition of your wrapper. So max width, and oftentimes we've used 1200 pixels. We can do that. People have used different units of measure. Some people prefer to use ems. Remember, an em, normally speaking, it turns out to be about 16 pixels. Now, if we define the base font size in our body as 1.1 em, then that really does change the size of the em and increases it a little bit. So each em here inside the body would actually be about 10% more than 16 pixels, would be a little bit less than 18 pixels. So you have to keep that in mind as well. All right, so we have the wrapper margin and the max width, which is the two most important rules that I think we can add to the wrapper. And we might want to then think about what kind of content we want to add to the body. So we can move down here to the body. If we have a rule for the wrapper, then probably want to add that wrapper div, right? Makes sense? So we want to add a div down here, and we want to give it a class attribute, and we want to use the name that we used inside of our CSS wrapper. Now, you don't put the dot here inside of the class name. When I first started out, I used to do that occasionally, and that is wrong, because if you use .wrapper for your class name, which is probably not a good idea to begin with, I think you'd probably have to create a selector that had two dots in front of it instead of just one. But bad idea to use anything but a letter as the first character in your class name. So we have a div with a class of wrapper, and we want to put that down towards the bottom here. So I'll close that div, and then I'll create a little note to myself saying this is the end of the dot wrapper div here, as I often do, and select that, and then use Dreamweaver's nice little auto comment button here on the far left hand edge of the interface. That first little dialog box there towards the bottom, click on that and hold. You'll see that you can apply various types of comments, and here we want to just apply a simple HTML comment. You could do that, by just typing it out with the exclamation point dash dash and then dash dash. But why type when you can have Dreamweaver type for you? That's my theory. All right, so at this point, again, I might want to stop for a moment and double check a few things. And again, I will be right back. All right, so far we have just a div with a class of wrapper on our HTML for our Founding Fathers page. And I think it's a good idea to try to fill in some of the basic HTML. Besides the div of wrapper, we want to probably start off with a container element, and header is oftentimes what we want to use at the very top of our file. And inside the header, we oftentimes will put a logo of some sort, some kind of identification, oftentimes an image, sometimes something that we've created inside Photoshop. Remember the Photoshop exercise that we did where we created the masthead image? That image would probably fit very nicely in the header element of our HTML. Of course, we don't have anything right at the moment that we've created that would run all the way across our page like we did for our Photoshop assignment for the Founding Fathers here, although we do have a number of different images that maybe we can look at later, and maybe we can find one or more images that could be used as a identification image, logo kind of a image for our page. For the time being, maybe what we do would be to simply put an H1 inside of the header. Oftentimes an H1, the top level heading, would go into our header area. And we could call this probably Founding Fathers. Why not? And maybe we could call this home page. I don't know. If you want to add that, perhaps you can change that later. But something like that. The H1, remember, the top level heading, should be some sort of short piece of text that encapsulates the main idea of the entire page. So we want to be semantically sound, using our headings correctly, and something like Founding Fathers homepage or something like that I think would be appropriate for this kind of a page. So what we could do, maybe add a div with a class of logo just as a placeholder. Often do that just to remind myself that I want to put some sort of an identification image in a certain position. And we could just leave that empty for the time being. It won't really show up visually on our page because, as we know, if you have a container element that has no content, the container element itself is just going to kind of shrink wrap all the way up and disappear. It's got to have some other content elements inside of it in order to actually be visible. So adding this div class of logo is just sort of a placeholder to remind us that we want to add an image. If you wanted to visually remind yourself, you could put some text in here. You could say add logo image here, something like that. And again, that would just be placeholder text. You can always change that and swap that out for a real image later on. All right, after the header, oftentimes I would create a navigation area. We can use the nav element, and that could go either above, inside of, or below the header. The nav element could go anywhere. You probably logically want to have your main navigation towards the top of the page. So that's why I say that you really should put it somewhere at the top. I oftentimes will put my nav either above the header or below the header. If you keep the nav separate from inside the header, I think it gives you a little bit more flexibility as to how you want to position and manipulate and stylize the nav elements that are going to go inside the nav element. So I think that that's not a bad approach. So let's just close this off. Again, not sure what the nav is going to be for this page. I have an idea that I could go into, maybe not right now, about how this page could fit in to a larger concept of a website. And if we were going to do something like that, we could make a navigation system that was a little broader. And if we do the kind of idea that I'm just not thinking of, I think it might be appropriate to put the nav actually above the header. So that's what I'm going to do. You notice that I grabbed the opening and closing nav tags, selected them, and grabbed them with my cursor. You can do that inside of the code view in Dreamweaver, and it makes moving your elements around and modifying your HTML a little bit easier to do. So that's a nice option to have, drag and drop text inside the code view. Anyway, for now, I think that would be good. After the header, we probably want to include a main element. So I'm going to put a main element here. And remember, the main element, as its name suggests, is created by the W3C a few years back in order to be a container for the main content of your page. And of course, that's up to you to decide, what the main content is something that, you have control over, presumably, unless you're working in a team. So, it's a matter of discretion, and it's more an artful choice than something that's purely programmatic or mandatory. So in this case, I think that the main elements, as we discussed in class earlier, going to be the sections that we talked about that are going to feature some of the most important and famous founding fathers of the American Republic. So I think those are the elements that are going to go into the main. And we discussed in class the idea of, for secondary content, having some information about, for example, the Declaration of Independence and also the forming of the Constitution of the United States, among other things that we could put in there. So we do have some ideas already kind of etched out in our brains for how we might want to work with the content on this page. So after the main then, we would probably want to add that aside, which is, again, a container element that is specifically there for us to use to include our secondary content. The aside, as again the name suggests, is something that is secondary, something that is on the side or that is thought of kind of after the main thought, that's sort of said, in a lower voice. He said something as an aside in conversation would be some comment that was a little more private or at a lower volume. So an aside is secondary, the kind of sidebar content that you might see in a magazine, for example. So we want to put some elements that we mentioned earlier in an aside. After the aside, we might want to then logically include our footer container. And we know that the footer is there for the copyright information and for any secondary or third level links. If we wanted to, we saw that many organizations and companies are using what I call fat footers to include a whole bunch of informations and links and all kinds of stuff inside their footers, and creating a really large secondary part of the website, that is sometimes as big as the main content. So there are a lot of different approaches and different things that you can do specifically with your footer. But I think for us, we might start out anyway just using Paragraph and just doing the normal, copyright here. I'll put copyright 2020, all rights reserved. And I'll put a pipe character, all wrongs righted. Don't we wish? And maybe I'll put a pipe character up here. And maybe that's all we'll put there for now. We can, again, add stuff later. All right, so that kind of fills out the real first level structure of our page. So right now we have, in terms of the visible contents of the page, we have, of course, the body element. We have our div with a class of wrapper surrounding all of the visible content. We have our nav elements. We have the header separate from the nav, coming right below the nav. Inside the header, we have the first level H1 with Founding Fathers homepage. And we also have a div with a class of logo that just has some placeholder text. We have the main element where we'll put most of the main information about the Founding Fathers. We have the aside where we'll put secondary content. And we have a little bit of content for our footer. So that is a pretty good start to what we want to do. Okay, so let's continue working on our Founding Fathers homepage. You can see I have it here in the live view, and it looks acceptable, but we want to make it much nicer looking than this. And of course, we need more content. We have the Latin text here, and we don't have any images, no logo on top, etc. So let's go back to Code View and do a little bit more work. We have the sections set up here now with a class of FF for all the sections, and then individual classes for each of the sections based upon the particular founding father that we're talking about. Now, we want to add images. That would be a very nice idea. To do that, it would add a lot of pizzazz to the page. And of course, we have lots of images in our images subfolder inside of the site definition here. And if you open this up, you'll see that we have, for example, an image of George Washington, georgewashington.jpg. And if you'll recall in class, what we did with some of the additions of images was to have Dreamweaver help us out by using the design view, not the live view, but go to live view and then click on the downward pointing triangle and go to design view, which allows us to grab images and other assets from the panels here on the right hand side and drop them right on our page. That way Dreamweaver will create a lot of the code for us that we would normally have to write ourselves. And as you know, my dictum is if you get somebody else or something else to write the code for you, then that's good. So I'm going to drag georgewashington.jpg and drop it right at the very beginning of the paragraph. I have my finger pushed down on the mouse right now. You can see that there's a cursor there, and when I let go of the mouse, the image should pop in wherever I have the cursor positioned. So I'm going to put it right in front of the first word of the paragraph. And bingo! We now see Mr. George Washington. But of course, this is just way too big, right? And remember, we talked about the fact that it's okay to add images and to resize them inside Dreamweaver in order to figure out exactly what the optimum size will be for your particular page. But you certainly don't want to leave it at that if you're going to take your page up onto the real website, the real web. So just keep that in mind. But because we're just creating a pseudo site, it's okay for us at the moment to resize this. And to do that, you can see that there are control points on the bottom and on the bottom right and left of the image when it's selected. So if you click on the image and you see these control points, the one that you want to grab is at the bottom right corner. So I have my cursor down here and I'm going to put it over that right hand corner, and you can see I can push it up and to the left. You want to hold down the shift key while you're doing that, and that constrains the aspect ratio so that you don't squeeze this out of joint here. And I think I want to make this relatively small. I'm going to push this till it's about 140 pixels tall and then let go. And the reason that I know that that's 100, wide, I'm sorry, not tall. The reason that I know that this particular image now is 140 pixels tall, or excuse me, wide, is that I have my properties inspector down at the bottom of the interface here, And when I have the image selected, you can see that it gives me a lot of information about that particular image. If you look down here in the Properties Inspector on the far left, you'll see that there's a little thumbnail of George Washington. It says image at 80 kilobytes. It also tells us where that image is in the images subfolder, and it's called georgewashington.jpg. And further to the right, you can see a W and an H input area. And of course, W stands for width and H stands for height. So when you push or pull your image, you can see in real time how the width and the height are changing. So I kept my eye on the width input there, and I let go of the cursor when it hit 140. I'm just guessing that that might be a decent size for us, given what we have right now. We can, again, always change that. So this is just sort of our first attempt at creating our design. But that looks fairly decent. The other thing that we want to do is to go into the code and double check to see exactly what Dreamweaver has done. I know some of you may be working on HTML editors that don't work like this if you don't have Dreamweaver. So you can see that the code is added there for us right at the beginning of the paragraph. We have the IMG tag. We have the crucial SRC attribute. The SRC attribute stands for source, and that tells the browser where our image is. And when we roll over the image, you can see that we have a little pop-up. Again, Dreamweaver is pretty cool about that. It gives us a lot of extra information as we are writing our code in the code view. Images / georgewashington.jpg. Now remember, you have to put the name of the subfolder in there if the subfolder is in a different position than the HTML page that you're adding the image to. So you can see in our site files, we have an images subfolder, and our HTML is outside of that images subfolder. Our HTML page is called fathers1.html. So if we want to add an image onto fathers1.html from the images subfolder, then in the source attribute of our image tag, we must put as a preface the name of the subfolder that those images are inside of. So pretty straightforward, pretty standard, but something that you've got to, get straight in your mind. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble adding your images to your pages. And you can see here that we also have a width and a height attribute. The width says, as we mentioned, 140. And remember, all property values inside of HTML elements should be double quoted. And again, as is not the case with cascading style sheets, with width and height attributes inside your HTML, you do not want to put the unit of measure. You don't want to put px there. If this were a cascading style sheet rule, this would be a mistake. You'd have to add unit of measure. But for attributes inside your HTML, that's not the case. The browser understands that 140 means 140 pixels. Also, we can see that there is an ALT attribute. And again, this is something that you should have with all of your images. ALT stands for alternate text. And this is something that you should add for those people who are looking at your page with devices, for people who don't have the ability to see your page correctly. So screen readers in particular. So here, Dreamweaver doesn't know what your image is, so it doesn't put anything inside there for the value of the alt attribute. So we have to do this ourselves, but we could just put, you don't want to put anything too long in there, just short, sweet, and to the point. George Washington is all you have to do for the ALT. And then we have the paragraph itself with the Latin text. So if we go back to the design view, you can see that it looks fairly good. You want to change the design view to live view in order to get a better idea of how this looks in the browser, and it looks about the same. Remember what I said though, the best way to judge whether or not something is correct is to look at it in a browser. So if we go and save our file and then right click on the tab inside the interface of Dreamweaver and go to Open in Browser, and I'm going to go down again to Google Chrome, we can see that we have our George Washington image. It's sitting below the George Washington H2 heading and right along inside of the paragraph. Now, as we noted in class, the problem here is that there's a whole bunch of empty space to the right of our image. And the way that we can fix that is to use the float property. We use float to create columns, but we also use float to float the text around a particular image so that it surrounds it and takes up the unused space that otherwise would be wasted. So this is not really good design to have that kind of empty space next to an image. We want the text to wrap around. So to do that, we want to go back to Dreamweaver and we want to create a rule. And we can do this in a number of ways, but let's create a rule, a class rule. This is oftentimes what I like to do. Create a class for floating left and for floating right. Remember, you can float things to the left and to the right. So I oftentimes will create cascading style sheet rules called dot float left and dot float right. And then I can just add these wherever I want to float a particular element. And of course, we want to use the float property inside of the float left rule, and we want to choose left. Another thing that is a good thing to do when you're setting up floats, if you recall, we mentioned this in class when we were doing this. What happens is that the floated element and the text ends up butting right up against the opposite side of the picture of the image. And that doesn't look too good either. You can see that here. Let me save this. And then this doesn't happen automatically, by the way. This is just the rule. It's not been set. It hasn't been applied to any element so far. So, there's nothing going to change until we actually use this float left class. And we can add this to our George Washington image. We want to add it right inside the George Washington image. We want to add a class and set it equal to float left. And again, Dreamweaver helps us out. As soon as we say class equals, we have a little drop down and it asks us, do you want to use one of the classes that have already been defined? Yes, we do. So you can just click on float left and Dreamweaver adds that, also uses the double quotes. So it's very nice. So if we look at our page again here now, save it, and you can see that everything underneath there has actually wrapped around. Now, the problem is that the text and the heading for Thomas Jefferson has also tried to get into the act by wrapping around the George Washington picture. That is not something that we like. So remember, whenever you float something, the same thing happens when we create columns. Whenever you float something, there's always a problem where elements right after the floated element will, try to wrap around. When we're doing column creation, that's kind of a bad thing. When we're trying to wrap text around an image, that's generally a good thing. But we don't want all the text underneath to try to wrap itself around our image. We just want certain elements to wrap around. So what we could do is tell the headings here, Thomas Jefferson in particular, but maybe make a rule for all the headings. We want all the headings to drop below anything that they see coming up on their left-hand side, or their right-hand side for that matter. And we can do that by using the clear property, just like we use the clear property on the footer when the footer starts to act weirdly after we float an aside in front of it. So if we added a clear property to maybe not just Thomas Jefferson, but to all of the H2 elements here, that would, I think, have the effect of pushing this element down so that it does not have anything on its left or its right side. Let's try that and see if that works. It's not something that I often do, so to be honest, this is something I'm just making up as we go along. Let's see if it works. So in order to select all the H2s in all of these sections, I have to try to figure out how to accomplish that. And using the FF that we've added to all these sections is going to help us, because every section has a class called FF. So if we want to select all of the H2s in all of these sections, then what we can do is use a descendant selector. We can start out with the FF class, and then we can tell the browser, select all the H2s that are anywhere inside of an element that has a class of FF. And that should select all of these H2s in all of our sections, which would be great, because that's very parsimonious. We're hitting a whole bunch of birds with one stone, although we don't want to hurt the birds. Let's try this out. We'll go .ff, and then we'll create the descendant selector by adding H2. And then we'll use the clear property like we've done for the footer when we're creating columns of information, and we'll choose both. So .ff space H2 should select all the headings that are inside of the FF sections. And we're telling the browser to tell the H2 to look to its right and to its left. And if it sees that there's anything to its right or left, it should drop down so that it goes below anything like that. So I'm going to save that and go out. Maybe we'll go out in the browser. See how that looks. Bingo! It always wants to translate our Latin for us. So now that works. We have Thomas Jefferson dropping below the George Washington image. Now, it doesn't really drop below enough, but we can add a little bit more space by creating either some padding or some margins. So that's not so bad. But the original problem has been taken care of, I think. Right, now, as I was saying before, though, when we float something and have text wrap around, the text ends up really encroaching on the image. And I don't think that that looks good when the text rides right up against the edge of the image. And you can see that if we float something to the left, the problem is always to the opposite side, to the right. So oftentimes what I will do whenever I create a float rule is, besides saying float left, I will add a margin in the opposite direction. So we could add margin dash right if there's a float left, and we could add something like 0.75 m, let's say. And that should push whatever it is that is on the right-hand side of our image away a little bit to give us about 3/4 of an m of breathing space. So if we look in the live view here this time, we can see that indeed we now have a nice little margin between the paragraph text and our image. So I think that looks considerably better. Now, we have a couple more problems, I think, with the spacing here on this page. First of all, I think that the H2 that is associated with our section is riding a little bit too high above the content. I would like to see this George Washington H2 a little bit closer to the image and to the paragraph that it's talking about. Also, as we mentioned, the various sections are still a little too close together vertically, and I would like to space them apart from the section above. So the second thing is, I think, a little bit easier to do than the first. So let's see what we can do with the problem of spacing out our sections. Oftentimes all you need to do is to add some margin, perhaps at the bottom, to each of the sections. And remember, all sections have the class of FF, right? So this FF really does come in handy. So we can make another rule called FF, and the FF actually is already connected to the section. The FF is the section. So we don't need a descendant selector. We're just talking straight out about FF itself. And what we want to do is add a margin bottom, I think. And maybe set that to about 3M. I'm not sure if that's going to work. We can take a look and see how effective that is. If we look in the live view now, see, sometimes the live view doesn't kick in margin bottom. The other thing is, when you float something and set it clear, sometimes margins are less effective than padding. So it's possible that we might have to use padding instead of margins. Let's take a look though. Let's go to Google and see what happens. Yeah. So you can see we added bottom margin to our sections, but Thomas Jefferson still is sitting there a little too close to George Washington. So I think what we want to do is try our hand at padding. If we add padding change the .ff to padding dash bottom 3M and save that. We can go out to our browser and reload, and that tends to work, but Thomas Jefferson is still, for some reason, hung up right underneath George Washington. So that is a problem. So let's take a look and see what might be happening here. We have section with class FF Washington, got an H2, paragraph, and a section. And underneath that, we have our second section with FF, H2, and a paragraph. Now, this does not have an image as of yet. So why don't we add an image here in Thomas Jefferson's section in order to equalize that out. And if we look in the images subfolder, I think we can find an image that has Mr. Jefferson somewhere. I'm sure we have it. Thomas Paine. There's Jefferson. There's our boy. So again, we could go out to Live View and then switch over to Design View. And then we could grab Jefferson.jpg and we could drag it out like we did with Washington. You can see the cursor there and drop it right in front. Now that image is much smaller to begin with, so we don't have to change it as much. I think it's nice if we have the same width on these images. So I'm going to see if I can squeeze this down to the same 140 pixels that we had for George Washington. And again, I'm keeping an eye on the width input in the Properties Inspector. There you go. By the way, now, if you don't see the Properties Inspector in your interface, you can always grab that by going up to the main window dropdown in Dreamweaver and then going to Properties. You can see here mine has a check mark in front of it on the left-hand side, which tells me that I have the properties open and visible. But if you don't see the Properties Inspector on your interface, then choose the Properties Inspector here in the window dropdown. When it shows up, it might be floating right in the middle of your interface. You can drag that down to the bottom, and when you see that blue line running across the horizontal part of the Properties Inspector, then let up on your mouse, and the Properties Inspector will kind of weld itself right into the bottom of the interface, like you can see mine here. All right, so now we have Thomas Jefferson image in the Tom Jefferson area, and we want to do the same thing that we did with George Washington image. We want to set that so that it has the float. So we can go in and we could just copy this, I guess. Copy class float left and just paste it right in the Thomas Jefferson area there. And when we look at the design view, look at the live view, you can see that we have George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Right, so the H2s are still a little too close together. Benjamin Franklin is riding up against Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's riding up against the bottom of George Washington. Let's go back to our code and go back to our cascading style sheets here. And what we could do would be to take the H2 here and add a little bit of margin top. Let's add 3M of margin top to the same rule that we had originally created. This is the H2s. So we're doing a clear and we're also adding margin top here. And if we go and look in the live view, again, not really seeing that when we have the images set up. Let's go out into Google Chrome. And that does tend to work. We are getting extra space there. I think it might be a nice idea to add a little bit more text inside of our sections. Maybe we want to actually use the document that we have that has extra text, the real text for each of our founding fathers. And we might want to create some kind of a sectioning to make sure that people understand where one section begins and where one section ends. You might want to put like a bottom border to these sections in order to border them off a little bit. So we could try that as well. Let's go back here. First of all, let's see if we can get some of the real content for our founding fathers. We have inside of our site definition fathers1.html, and underneath that we have founding fathers text.docx. If I double click that, at least on my Mac, it will open up very nicely inside of Word. And I have some text. The text I have for George Washington, this first part of the text is just a quotation. We could add that, but I think I want to add some explanation as well as a quotation. So let me copy that. And we can paste that in over this Latin text. I'll go paste. But I also want to add a little introductory, because this is like a long quotation, which maybe we should put inside of a block quote. Probably not a bad idea. Let's do that now. Let's add a block quote in front of this long quotation. And let's end the block quote here. And we can also put a cite tag here, because it's telling us that this was from Washington's farewell address in 1796. But I want to put something up here that really explains a little bit more about George. And I don't have that. I thought I did. Let's go out onto the browser and let's go to Google, and let's Google George Washington. And we could just go to Wikipedia and we could grab the first part of this paragraph that Wikipedia has about George Washington and copy that. Then we can jump back to Dreamweaver. You know how easy it is to jump back and forth. And we can copy and paste from text elements from the web, from anywhere, and paste it right in to our section here. Now, this is a paragraph, and we already have a block quote here, so I'm going to grab this ending paragraph tag and put it here so that we have a beginning and an ending paragraph for the descriptive part, and then we have a block quote for the actual quotation from Washington's farewell address. So we have a considerable amount of information now. We can save that. We can go out to Google and take a look at our page, refresh the page, and yes. Now we see a lot of our formatting has taken effect here. We probably now have a little bit too much space between these. So we have George Washington, we have the actual paragraph that's descriptive, and then we have the block quote that has information from the farewell address. And I think maybe this kind of looks a little funny dropping down. I think it probably would look better if we had Washington farewell address on the same line here. So I'm not sure why that dropped down. I think because the block quote is a block level element, I see. Normally, remember, I put cite tags inside of the block, so I think it would look better if we surrounded the cite tag like we normally have in class with the block quote. And you can see that we can have a cite tag even at the end. A lot of times in class we put a cite tag at the beginning of a long quotation, but doesn't matter. In fact, most of the time the citations come at the end. So when we make that change and then go out and look at it in Google and refresh, we can see that the attribution now, the citation, comes right after. I think that looks real nice, coming right after the long quotation. So I think that that section looks pretty good. The only thing is, as I mentioned earlier, might want to bring the George Washington heading down a little bit so that it's a little bit closer. There's a little bit too much margin between the paragraph here and the H2. And if you recall, we have a bit of a tussle because remember there is bottom margin on the H2s and there's top margin on the paragraphs, and sometimes those things combine, so we may have to write more than one rule in order to get rid of this. So again, let's go back to the code and go up to the HTML. Now we had some extra margin that we added to the H2 at the top, and I think that that's too much. I think maybe just want to make that 1M, if that. We can go back and manipulate that later. But we also want to limit the amount of margin that there is on the bottom. So we could write a second rule. We could put these rules together, but just for illustrative purposes, I'll write two separate rules, and maybe I'll just put 0. But we know that sometimes that may not be a help because it could be the top margin of the element below that's actually creating the space. So what we're doing right now is we're selecting all those headings, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, etc., and we're telling the browser don't have any bottom margin. Anything on the bottom when it comes to this particular element, try to knock that off. Let's see what the effect is. Go back to Google, and when we refresh, the page moves up a little bit, but we still basically have about the same space. I'm thinking that if it's not the margin that comes from the bottom element, then it could be the margin on top that comes from the top element. So we might want to create a rule for .ff paragraph. Now the problem here is that, this might be a little dangerous because if we eliminate all of the margin on the top of the paragraphs, you don't know whether or not you're opening up a can of worms. There might be some unintended consequences elsewhere on the page. But anyway, we have tried to limit the selection by using a descendant selector. We're only talking about paragraphs that are inside these sections. Well, let's see what happens when we go margin top on these guys and set the top margin to 0 for the paragraphs. Remember, it's the paragraph and the H2, the space between these guys, that we are trying to limit. So if we eliminate the bottom margin on the H2 and the top margin on the paragraph, you would think that we would really reduce the space. So let's save that and refresh, and indeed that does work. So now we have George Washington right close by both the image and the text. Now, to my eye, that might be a little too much. So maybe what we could do would be to add back a little bit of either top margin on the H2 or, bottom margin on the H2 or top margin on the paragraph, whichever one. I think the least dangerous would be to add that back on the H2. So let's say we went with 0.8 for margin bottom on the H2. That's 8/10 of an M. And remember, an M is about 16 pixels. So that's about 13 pixels of space, thereabouts. So if we save that and go out and look at the browser, refresh, that's too much again. So it's back and forth. Maybe all we want is, at that rate, maybe all we want is about 2/10. Sometimes you have to just go back and forth with something. That's about right. Maybe a quarter, maybe 2.5. 2.5, a quarter of an M, that's 4 pixels about. Although, remember, we make our M's a little bit bigger. That's true. When we made the font size 1.1 M, our M's are actually closer to 18 pixels. So each time we use an M inside this page now, the M itself is considered to be a little bit bigger. So maybe that's the reason why it's such a dramatic difference to 0.8. So let's look at that. Yeah, that's about right. A quarter of an M. And again, it's up to you. If you want more space or less space, it's all in the eye of the designer or developer. So you can manipulate that however you'd like. But now that's starting to look pretty good. You can see when we have some content inside of our section and we bust out below the baseline of the image, then the padding and margin that we've set for the sections starts to take hold. And now, as I say, we probably got a little bit too much. But we can figure out how to do that in just a moment. All right, boys and girls, I think that's probably going to be it for today for the content, instructional content, for March 20th, Monday, our first day back as an online class. Now, remember that I told you that in each of these videos, I would also be asking you some quiz questions. This is going to be in lieu of actually taking the normal quizzes. I figured that we would have 2 more quizzes normally before the end of the term, and each of those would probably have 25 questions or so. That would be about 50 questions total. So if I gave you 5 questions each time we meet in class virtually here, I think it would end up being just about the same amount of questions. So consider this to be a part of your quiz. And you can see here that I have these questions set up for you. March 20th, video questions, true or false? Number 1, line height values do not need to reference a unit of measure. Number 2, the style element should be placed right after the opening body tag. Number 3, max width values must always be stated in pixels. Number 4, if you use multiple classes on a single element, you must use separate sets of quotation marks for each class. And number 5, you can use Dreamweaver's Properties panel to help you resize an image in the design view. So those are the 5 questions for March 20th. So please listen to the video, look at these questions. It's just true, false. So you can send me an email with just your answers. So you can put number 1, true, number 2, false, number 3, true, number 4, false, number 5, true, whatever it is. Just send me that along with an indication of which sets of questions you are answering. So I think what I'll do instead of numbering these is just put the date. So the date here will be March 20th. And remember, I'm going to try to go by our normal class schedule. So I'm going to upload this file on Monday, and then I'm going to upload another video file on Wednesdays and go through the same routine. And I will probably, for at least the next 3 weeks or so, I will be giving you some homework assignments on Wednesday, as we normally would during the year. The other thing is, as I've mentioned on the blog, our Logjam website, I want to give you feedback on your homework. You have the online resume due this Monday, March 20th. So please send that to me. Remember, I want everything to go to my own Prairie studio address in order to take the stress off of the Oakton servers. So send that to john@prairiestudio.com. And I am going to make another video every week that we have homework, where I will give you feedback on all the stuff that you send me so that you have an idea of where you're going right and where you're going wrong. Again, try to mimic what we would normally do in class. Try to keep to the same general schedule, do the same sorts of exercises, the same kinds of homework, the same kinds of feedback. So I'm trying to keep it pretty much organized the way that it was originally, and hopefully that will help you to understand what's happening and how to get through the next 6 weeks. So hopefully that will help. All right, I will talk to you. Be sure, remember to put a comment in the blog, in the Logjam website page for this particular video, letting me know that essentially, that's sort of like saying that you're present. Leave a comment saying, I'm here. If you have a question or if you have a substantive comment, even better. Put that down on the Logjam blog, our class website. Remember, I changed the idea of looking at the videos on my YouTube channel because I found that it was much easier to simply create a link right on our website. So that way, all you have to do is go to the website. That's the only place that you'll have to go to for content. That, and then send me your work to john@prairiestudio.com. All right, I hope you're all safe and well, and looking forward to seeing how the online class works. Thanks.